My family has always had weird run-ins with the supernatural. I can't tell you how far back it runs for sure, but I could start with my grandfather, who sadly passed away in 2018. There are so many great stories I would love to share with people that don't necessarily relate to the supernatural, but let me put the man into perspective with a short one. Well, as short as my Gabby self can make it. He loved to watch me play and frequently had me sit outside near his workshop so he could watch me. I was a definite tomboy, so watching the confusing mess of Transformers having a tea party or Barbies beating the hell out of each other was probably very amusing. In the 80s, I was a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle fanatic, as many young boys and girls were. I don't think he really understood it, because he was asked things like, so what is Character X's superpowers? Like they were Superman or Spider-Man or something. I guess they did have superpowers, but it was mostly just martial arts and stuff. I recall him specifically asking about my favourite villain on the show, Rocksteady. I didn't know. I just liked his design and never understood how Bebop surpassed him in popularity, to the point of being considered a much more formidable fighter. A rhino would destroy a warthog if they fought. I was at a bit of a loss, so my preschool brain just started listing things he might have or might have been capable of. I know Big Machine Gun was one of the superpowers I gave him, really one of the best superpowers when you think about it. But I also said he could pick up a car. My grandfather laughed and finished wiping off a wrench, then walked over to his pickup and just effortlessly picked one end of it up off the ground. That was cool, because in my young mind, that meant my grandfather had superpowers. In hindsight, I realise I'm probably misremembering it. It probably wasn't effortless, and while I remember it being the front end with the engine, it was probably the back end with an empty pickup bed. He was a big guy, but no one is that strong. He was always a sort of superhero to me and the rest of the family, and even 3 years later, I miss him so much. When it came to the supernatural, it was like whenever he showed up, whatever ghost or demon or monster would just run in terror. It's like how you can scare away coyotes with the urine of larger predators like cougars, wolves, or bears. Comparing him to cat piss might not be the most flattering thing, but it was like his presence always filled the room. And if he scowled everyone, and if he smiled, everyone was filled with mirth, and if he cried, well, he never cried, but a few times, and it was always one of us going through trauma that made him cry. Story 1. The Haunted House. Like the time my mother apparently almost died, it was very early in her life. She, my aunts, and my grandparents moved to a small, cheap house in the country, their first real home after living in a trailer up to that point. This would have been 1967. Mom was 3. An old Chickasaw woman had lived there previously. We are part Cherokee, allegedly. I don't want to go full Elizabeth Warren here, but mostly Irish, and my family is definitely Christian. Southern Baptists. This woman held on to tribal beliefs. I sadly don't have much of a story to narrate here. I wasn't there, and all my information is secondhand from those 4 family members. But I wanted to share it, as any time ghost stories came up, this was one that was told, and I've heard it many times. The house was in a state of disrepair, but one of the things that really stuck out to my grandmother was that she had driven nails halfway into the floor in a circle around her bed, and wrapped strands of her hair around them, connecting them and making a sort of tripwire. It was an odd thing to do, to say the least, and my grandmother just sort of shrugged and pulled it all up. The previous owner had her reasons, apparently. Yes, this house was very haunted. I think mostly by tricksters, given the majority of the paranormal activity was mostly harmless. But as someone who has only been told about it, I can't really say how harmless these sorts of things were. Lights would flicker. Things would never be where you left them. Sometimes they'd disappear. Sometimes big things would disappear. Like my aunts and mother had hula hoops that they put under their beds, that vanished the next morning, never to be seen again. Doors and windows would open and shut randomly. Pictures would fall off the wall. Animals from dogs to chickens to cats to cows were spooked all the time. I was told that whenever they prayed, these paranormal activities would stop for the rest of the night. But allegedly, If my grandfather got mad and yelled at them, they'd stop for days. Most often a door would start opening and he'd turn around in a fury, "By all means, come on in," and it would stop halfway. Once it even went so far as to shut itself back, as though to apologise. My mother has never dared say this to either of my very religious grandparents, as they would have spanked her then and been quite upset now. But she thought that whatever these entities were more afraid of my grandfather than they were of God. But the house wasn't the most haunted part of the property. There was a barn and an old shed. My grandmother put my aunt's and mother's toys in the shed and redecorated it as a sort of playhouse. It burned down the next day. There was no electricity or gas in the shed, and her girls were fortunately not in it. So how and why was highly suspicious to say the least, but it was next to that barn. The barn apparently was especially bad. Grandfather allegedly heard voices inside of it and would have to tell them to shut up, which apparently worked. But he didn't like the voices. According to him, they sounded very malevolent. They had a pair of Great Pyrenees named Siberia and Alaska, or some large breeding pairs I have heard multiple breeds cited, and I'm a little uncertain. The only thing that is agreed on is that they were good dogs, big dogs and white dogs. They would come into the house cautiously, and if anything paranormal happened, would stand up and bark or flee. But they refused to enter that barn. They'd stand at the edge and growl and bark. This came to a head when my aunt and mother were pressured into the barn by a few of their cousins who were visiting. Nothing had happened after they were in there for a bit, though Siberia and Alaska were visibly stressed about these children being in there. After a while of nothing spooky happening, other than two giant whimpering dogs, they decided to climb to the hayloft. I'm not sure if it was Easter, but they had some toy eggs, and the four older children decided to pretend to be chickens and let my mum get the eggs out from under them. Eventually, one of the male cousins thought it would be funny to act like an angry hen, flapping his arms and approaching her like a chicken might when ready to flog someone. My mother backed up on the edge of the hayloft and fell. My aunt and all three cousins swear she was several feet from the edge. Then the next moment, she was over. But there was a lot of guilt there for some 6 to 7-year-olds to bear. All four, with the two dogs in a row, ran to get my grandparents, and my grandmother grabbed up my unconscious mother and started wailing and praying. My grandfather drove through a fence in his truck to meet her halfway as quickly as possible. But halfway there, she woke up. Apparently she asked why my grandmother was crying. Grandma thanked God and still ran with her to the truck. Once in the truck and preparing to leave, my grandfather asked her what happened. He was obviously more panicked than angry, but he suspected one of the other children might have pushed her out of the loft, even by accident. My aunt said the cousin who had scared her had been freaking out, screaming and crying out that he never touched her, which, while an understandable response, is a little sus. She smiled and said, "I fell and Jesus caught me." That was enough for them, and they got her to the hospital. Her head was and still is concave from this. Her soft toddler skull might have actually saved her, but she suffers from chronic migraines to this day, pressure from her brain against her lightly dented skull. After being released that day with a mild concussion, my grandfather questioned her again. What happened? My mother doesn't remember saying this or the last thing. Severe head trauma does that, I suppose. But my grandparents say this is what she said. Jesus caught me, but the devil pushed me. When they returned, Siberia had been ran over, and Alaska was nowhere to be found. Alaska was apparently never recovered. You won't find this house. My grandfather moved his family out and tried to sell it with warnings to the buyers. Sadly, his honesty scared away many prospective buyers, even at a discounted price. Though the issue solved itself. Allegedly, a bear went into both barn and house and in a panicking frenzy, started clawing up and biting everything in there, eventually knocking both of them down, and after it left presumably, a fire started from a ruptured line leading to the propane tank. My grandfather fortunately had it insured, but only took what he had been trying to sell it for. he was honest to a fault like that. Story 2, The Witch. I won't go into detail about my father, but he wasn't a supernatural horror. We can leave it at this. He paid child support and visited me for only a few months after my mother divorced him. Later, when my mother considered suing him for back payments, my grandfather took her aside and told her he'd made a deal with him. He stops being around me, and he doesn't have to pay her monthly stipend and gets to keep functioning legs. My mother wasn't mad when she learned this because he's just that bad. Grandpa basically paid everything she needed for the vast majority of my youth, except when she remarried. My first stepfather was an interesting man. I don't hold any grudges against him, but he liked scaring his daughter and me. A lot of it is stuff I can't remember. I was about 3 or 4 at the time and my stepsister a year younger than me. But allegedly there was an incident with a trampoline where the two of us were having trouble getting up. Despite what other people were saying, he wouldn't stop bouncing on it and thought our predicament was funny. Bullyish, but not something that calls for someone jumping onto the trampoline, tackling him off it and onto the ground, and punching him in the face over and over. But my mother did that. I just don't recall it. It seems far-fetched too. I've met the man in my teen years and he's a good 6'4" and built like a brick shithouse. My mum was big, 5'10", but nowhere near that bulky. I suspect for the longest time the story was exaggerated. I know it happened because when I was a teen I ran into him. He admitted to me during that meeting it did in fact happen, apologised, and asked if my mom was mad. No, we really didn't have any animosity towards him. It was his ex-wife that was the issue. I want you to think about this. A man who does that kind of thing got custody of daughter over his wife. This was the mid to late 80s too. That sort of thing is rare. The mother almost always gets custody, and the reason he did was really obvious. The ex-wife was a sociopath, even if you don't believe in supernatural things. I never heard them talk about this at the time. They were probably afraid of scaring me. But before even remarrying the stepfather, warned her about his ex-wife. That she believed she was a witch. Not some new age hippie Wiccan bullshit or neo-Nazi twerp getting in touch with their pagan ancestors, like a Satan worshipping witch. Nor was she some edgy atheist saying that to get the goat of their Christian contemporaries either. She went all in. I do remember a lot of it. My stepsister was a bit mean. We had fun playing and all, but she would randomly flip out and bite me. It didn't hurt really. I just kind of shoved her off, but there was something wrong with her. The nightlight in our shared bedroom burst one night, and she claimed to have done it by staring at it. That horrified my mother, but kind of amazed me. I liked superhero stuff, so I asked her if she was a psychic, and that made her laugh. She said she had animals like crows, rats and snakes come to her in the night with glowing red eyes, who would tell her to kill my mother and I with a butcher knife. Right down to how to do it, slit our throats. My mother and grandmother insisted we pray that away, and she would claim that won't work. And when asked why, my heart doesn't belong to Jesus, it belongs to Satan. Firstly, I remember my grandmother was very religious, right? This caused a major freak out from her. Grab the child in a hug and start praying for hours sort of freak out, regardless of how much she struggled. Secondly, I bet you're assuming that this was put into her head by her mother, right? This is my 6-year-old said something really woke, red-pilled about politician X yesterday, tier nonsense. Something a child would not only ever say, if it was put there, and encouraged by an adult. Her mom didn't have any visitation rates. She was that bad. He divorced her when my then stepsister was a year old. Our trailer? Haha, yes, trailer trash. My family not having a lot of money when I was a child is so funny. When at least 3 bedrooms, and I have to say, in the guest bedroom, had all my things moved into it. She hid all the knives in the pantries instead of drawers. Out of reach and of sight as an extra precaution. I tried to get my then stepfather to take her to a therapist. He didn't believe in that kind of stuff, so it was more church and more Sunday school, but more of my grandmother working with her. The situation boiled over, and when she broke one of my toys, well, broke being a nice way of putting it, in the case one of those silly Pizza Hut puppets from the Land Before Time movie, Triceratops was my favourite dinosaur. Sarah was her favourite character from the movie. There was only one, and we fought over it prolifically, to the point that we'd raid each other's rooms for it. Finally, she did manage to get that knife she was threatening us with, and out of spite, hacked Sarah's head off. I remember starting to cry, then getting angry. I was so mad. Madder than I think I've ever been at any point. I know, it was just some dumb fast food toy, but you have to remember I was just a little girl. I didn't even consider that she had a knife. I just slapped her onto the floor. She ran crying, and I'll admit, some guilt. I expected a punishment, but a child who said she was having visions and dreams of demonic animals, telling her to kill the two of us with a knife, just like the one she had when I knocked her down, probably stayed my mother's hand from being too harsh. She told me it was very important. I learned to control my temper, though, and said she was proud of me for not acting until there was a physical threat. Except, I never perceived her as a physical threat. I'd acted entirely out of being upset about the toy. I never thought she would stab me with the knife, and it was only later that I would find out the full extent of this. The stepfather was slightly more angry about it, but he had never disciplined her for biting me, so considered it par for the course. Parenting is hard, am I right? Again, this man gets sole custody without visitation rights, and that says more about her than it does him. That should be the end of it, right? Oh, poor naive reader. All of this was just a gathering storm. It started with calls to my grandparents, asking where my mother lived. It was a weird question. They didn't answer and wanted to know who was calling and why. The other person got progressively more frustrated as my grandmother tore apart the inconsistencies and factual impossibilities of what this woman was claiming before she started blabbering in tongues, hissing and growling into the phone, and then said she put a curse on her. My grandmother told her plainly, "My God protects me. Your curse is useless. Who is this?" She hung up. My aunt got a similar call. It ended in a similar way. This, like many parts of the story, were things I would find out about later. Some of this, like the phone call, I only knew partially about until recently, when I was making sure I had my facts straight on these stories. I knew about the ending, but I didn't know she was pumping them for info. The stepfather had insisted on an unlisted number. This was why. A month later, someone apparently spilled the beans. No idea who, but they probably didn't even realise what they'd done. Harassing calls, day in, day out, saying horrible things on the other end. Claims of curses, threats of death. I recall when that huge 6'4" man found out. Both he and my mother were, shall we say, carnal Christians. Not serious about the faith, but the second he realised what was going on, he fell to his knees and stared at the ceiling with tears in her eyes, grabbed up his daughter and started begging whatever powers that it could be stopped. That she wouldn't find them. He did this just as long as my grandmother, the religious fanatic, had, when she prayed with that same little girl over the Satan comment. I remember that. I remember that vividly. And frankly, it scared me that he was afraid. Not to mention it scared my mother and her stepsister. We were all right to be afraid. The police were called, but apparently the psycho was using a payphone. My mother just eventually left the phone off the hook. But when she unhooked the phone, the calls just got redirected to my grandparents. My grandfather almost opened every phone call with a snarl. I recall him completely lose it on this woman, and then threatened to eat her alive. Promised to eat her alive. Went into details about it while he gripped a metal framed chair so hard he bent it. My grandmother grabbed me and ran into the other room with me to spare me having to hear too much of this heated conversation. I'd say it was no longer safe at my grandparents', but that would be a lie. It was the safest place I could have been. A couple of weeks later, after my mother just unhooked the phone, it stopped. That Saturday, a woman came while it was still dark out, just barely lit by the rising sun. Our dog started barking. That is normal. Someone pulls into the driveway, they bark. They see a skunk or raccoon, they bark. But this bark was threatening. This bark was full of anger and fear and malice. It made the hairs on my neck stand up. They were really worked up about this. My mother came out to see what she wanted, with a shotgun in hand. As I was now awake, I went to the window to watch, peeking from the safety of a curtain. My mother didn't like her. I could tell from facial features alone. Neither did a single one of our dogs. She was fun. Pretty, I suppose, but I don't think a 4-year-old is the best judge of what is and is not beautiful. She had blonde hair and blue eyes and wore a red shirt and black pants, and a dark-coloured car. I couldn't tell you much more than that, other than after a moment of appraising her, I didn't like her either. It's hard to describe. Have you ever just looked at someone and immediately disliked them? You have no idea why. You don't normally judge books by the covers. And the cover, their outer appearance, can't even be pleasing. But something is just off. Something that makes you angry or afraid. The conversation started getting tense. The woman kept asking my mother to put the dogs away so she could come into the yard and talk. My mum might have noticed a massive head injury, but was and is no fool. She refused and demanded to know who she was. Immediate hostility. She started screaming at my mom to give her daughter and how she knew she was alone. I'm not sure what my stepsister was doing at the time. Surely she was awake from all this noise? Was she watching this from a window too? To this day, I have no idea. The dogs went berserk with fury as she screamed at my ma. The crazy person turned to look down and hiss at them, spit on them. She raised a hand like she was going to slap them. All of these were mistakes. They were not little dogs, and that had only made them angrier. My mother told us to leave. She started saying she'd call on all the dark powers to put a hex on my mom and her family. I couldn't tell you exactly what was said, but even in my relatively innocent child mind, I wanted my mom to just shoot her. Unfortunately, there are laws even in a red state that ensure doing that to someone who wasn't so much as entered your fence perimeter is highly illegal. Even if that person exudes contempt. My mother fired the shotgun to the ground. The dogs didn't start barking. Not even for a second. That was unusual. Usually gunshots and fireworks scared them, but they were so furiously angry at this woman's very presence that it only seemed to agitate them more. Like they were all snarling and barking and howling in a chorus to cheer my mom on to murder. I guess boomstick trumps black magic. At least in the more immediate and face-to-face sense. Because after my mother's warning shot, she got into her car and peeled out. My mother immediately reconnected the phone and called my grandmother. As she did, I snuck out to ask questions, but she shooed me. So I went to the living room to start watching cartoons. I could listen to what they were saying in the kitchen anyway. The stepfather was out camping and fishing with my grandfather and some other men to try to wind down after the harrowing ordeal that we thought was over. Nana said she would go get them. My mom called the police next. But as she did, the dog started barking again. The same malicious barking. I heard my mother profane and suspect that she was looking out a window in the other room. But little 4-year-old me was used to seeing my mum's just stick her head out. I wanted to see what was going on. I moved over to the door and gently unknocked, then opened it. Just enough to see my head out and peek inside. Not smart. Kids are dumb, and the younger the kid, the dumber they are. I saw a car tossing gravel as it left the driveway again, the same one from earlier. Our dogs were at the chain link nearest the vehicle was last. Biting the metal, rearing up on their hind legs and baying like hounds. They weren't outside, but I've never seen a dog angry at someone for just being there. The biggest one was Rusty, a chow mixed with some other massive breed. just enough to make out his wrinkles. He was a good dog and he loved me especially. He looked back to see me and it was like panic in his eyes, like, no, don't come out here, little one. I came out there. The sun was just a little more up. It was more light than dark now. I started walking over to them to see what was going on, and he got in the front of mine. I moved past him and he did it again and again. A big red furry handle. He staled me long enough for my mother to come out, and she probably still had the gun. She demanded I come back inside, but I could see something on the hood of her car. I disobeyed, dashed past my overprotective Dodd before my overprotective mother could catch me, and immediately regretted everything. Something had gutted our cats. One was Braveheart, and the other Lion from Care Bears, as this was about a decade before the Mel Gibson movie. She was a feisty barn cat, not the kind of animal that would let you catch her easily, and the sort that you didn't want to be touched. The other was Tigger. He was easily one of the most affectionate cats I've ever known. So lovable that my stepsister, my cousin and I would wag him around like a rag doll, and even dress him in doll clothes, and he wouldn't even try to get that way. There was no way she didn't kill him before confronting my mother. It might not have clicked for me at the time, but looking back on it, they were already dead when my mother confronted her. There's no way Braveheart would let her catch him that quickly. Tigger, I could believe just strolling right up to her, if it weren't for the sheer unnerved fury she caused on the dogs. She split both of them from anus to cheek and splayed their organs across the front and back of my mother's car. The hood, the trunk, the windshields. She'd stretched out their legs to mimic Christ on the cross. The next thing I knew, I was being lifted up off the ground. It was then I snapped back to reality. I started wailing. I'm not so sure for how long I did it, but it was understandably inconsolable. My stepsister was confused and I was dragged back inside, finally making her appearance. But when I blubbered out that Tiger was dead, soon she joined me in natural hysterics. My mum joined her call with the police, explaining what happened in a much less calm tone, then locked all the doors and windows before taking the children to console as best she could, gun in the grabbing distance. She only left to check when the dogs barked at something, or when they were quiet for too long. My grandfather and stepfather were the first. My grandma apparently drove to the fishing hole to tell them what happened. They cleaned up the animals, buried them, wiped the blood off my mum's car. Grandpa then cleaned up and came in to hold me, specifically, and stay with my mum until the police arrived. But my stepfather? He grabbed his daughter and left, without a word. That would be the last I would see either of them for some time. I suspect this is what he wanted to apologise for more than the trampoline, though I had mentioned that first as a joke. My mother followed him asking questions, but he was frank. She was after them, not her. If only. The police took down her description. They pretty much knew who she was, and as I understand it, arrested her before that day was over. I was too young to be privy to the exact charges, but yeah, it turns out going on other people's property, threatening them, murdering their pets and vandalising their car is something that is against the law, and she has a repeated offender. Somehow it got worse. Those hexes and curses she was throwing around this entire time became manifest. Demonic forms began taking shape in our mobile home. It's all a blur. I know at one point my mother threw a plate at one that was taunting them from a door. I could hear a scream in the middle of the night. I recall humanoid shapes with jagged sharp teeth. Some with shark teeth, some with fangs like a snake. Red or black or pallor skin. All manner of eyes, all of them glowing. Still pupils for some, groat eyes for others. Just a mangarine of parts jumbled together. Some recognisable, some not. The dogs became afraid to go inside the house where normally it was a chore to keep them out. But the only thing that will always stand out is one that chooses to torment me specifically. All the others were a glimpse and it was gone sort of affair. This one though, this one made itself very well known to me. The first time was in the bath. I sat in with some toys and began washing up. The faucet in that bathroom always dripped. But the dripping started getting faster, more erratic, then more a steady thin stream. I tried to turn it off, thinking I had accidentally nudged the knobs, but they were turned tight. The colour of the water turned purple, and it started to take shape. A dragon. But it was unlike any dragon I'd ever seen. Lips curled up, showing entirely too much of its gums, where rows and rows of conical dagger teeth-like rested. Covered in dully smoky purple scales, red glowing eyes with reptilian pupils like that of a snake, and black goat horns growing out the back of its head. Muzzle was sticky, somewhat circular. I recall screaming and thrashing and running out of the bathroom as it opened its maw. How it managed to be so big I can't say, but its head and neck seemed to fill the entire tub, yet it came from such a small hole. Naturally, it was gone as though it was never there when my mother came, though she recognised the danger and believed every word I had to say. She was in tears, and I remember her just hugging me and having me sleep with her. This was the final straw before I was sent to my grandparents. Though my mother would alternate between there and the house, she didn't want to abandon it entirely in case there were accomplices of the sociopath. Also, to take care of our dogs who did stay. I was terrified to take a bath after that. I had to have her presence again, like I had devolved as a person 2 years. She didn't help me. I just wanted her there at all times, and if not her, then my grandmother. It didn't matter that I was out of the haunted house, though mostly because I kept having nightmares of the thing. While staying at our home, my mother remembers having an angelic figure shake her and yell at her to wake up. When she did, she saw a gremlin-like creature toying with a box fan, and then lit it on fire as it vanished into thin air. She managed to put out the fire, and that was it. She and my grandparents went through the home chanting scripture, drawing crosses on all the windows and doors with chalk, and more or less performing an exorcism. It seemed to work, and eventually we went back. This was the point my mother went to testify, and all that lunacy happened. For her, this was about where things returned to normal. Not so for me, but that's part 3. When my mother went to testify with the rest of my family for emotional support, the witch would have psychotic outbursts. I fortunately wasn't there, nor was my now ex-stepfather or ex-stepsister. The witch would still scream and demand to know where they were. My mother didn't answer, obviously, but eventually did turn and snarl, "Even if I knew, I would never tell you." This just made her behave more erratically, chant praises to the devil, and do other absolutely off-your-rocker type stuff. Let me be clear, I hate witch hunts. It's disgusting and barbaric, and many people died because some liar didn't like them. But witch burnings? If they were acting like this? Not saying I agree, but I understand. She'd apparently behaved a little less loony in the divorce hearings with ex-stepfather, but was still erratic there and had a criminal record. But that, combined with this, was enough for her to get put in an asylum. The next best thing to burning, I suppose. But if even half of what I have heard about her is true, there is no curing that woman, and to be frank, yes, I believe she did consort with demonic entities. If it makes you feel any better, my stepsister went on to apparently lead a pretty normal life, and is happily married with children of her own now. Her mother never entered her life to my knowledge. I can sympathise. Went from about 2 to about 20-something without seeing my father. My mother became more faithful, and even if I'm not some hardcore Christian after this experience, it's hard for me to not at least believe in the supernatural. That, and I would have more experience with supernatural entities sealed it. And there was one from the saga I couldn't shake. Story 3, The Hell Dragon. The dragon stayed with me. It would haunt my dreams. In my dreams, I got to see its entire body. Kind of built like a horse, huge bat-like wings, a long tail that ended in a morning star style mace, and webbed eagle-like talons on front and back feet. It was huge, big enough to swallow an adult man whole. And it did. The closest thing I can think of to the way its mouth operated is the goblin shark. Only it had no protrusion or big nose, just a stubby snout like a cat's or a mastiff that got wider at the end to accommodate those massive extendable jaws. It was also not bestial at all. Sadistic and clearly intelligent, it took great pleasure in tormenting the people in my dreams in front of me. It took great pleasure in tormenting me, laughing, cackling with a low, rumbling voice like thunder, while it toyed with someone like a cat might a mouse. It only appeared near water, so a family member, friend, pet, or even fictional character I liked would venture too close to a lake, pond, puddle, swimming pool, sink, bird bath, even a glass of water, and it would lunge out of it and eat them and then disappear again, or maim them, then wait for them to stumble to another water source so it could do it again. No matter how much I warned people in the dreams, they'd always end up wandering too close to the water, then get snatched up. It didn't always swallow people whole either. It was always worse when it chewed. Those teeth were the size of butcher knives. Its victims, I don't even know where to begin. Naturally, they included my mother, grandparents, aunt, uncle, cousin, and family in general. Pets, of course, my Sunday school teacher, the local pastor, his wife. Friends, sure. But then some of the people were just random and bizarre. A few local news anchors, sitcom characters or their actors. Several people I just met in passing or saw on TV briefly. Sometimes people I didn't even know or stray animals. Then there was the really bizarre ones. Sometimes I would pray for help and it would arrive. Or else all these people were just minding their own business when this hell dragon would show up. Bruce Lee, Chuck Norris, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, dead, 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 dead. Even with guns. It might all sound very silly, but this was a monster putting things in terms that a young child would understand. Anything I could think of that might protect me. Anything I could think of that could fight it. Anything that might make me feel safe. Sure, it brought them into being in my dream just to massacre them. Ninja Turtles tried to flee to the sewer. I warned them. They did it anyway and all died. I could just hear them screaming. Then it would peer out of a storm drain at me and grin. Disappear, stick its head out of a manhole covering and spit their weapons at my feet. Ronald Reagan. My family were Reagan Democrats, but they still had a lot of nasty things to say about him and did so in front of me with impunity. But the consensus was still he was a good Christian man. That good Christian man tried to get me into a helicopter, but from a nearby fountain, it just materialised a single massive clawed foot. For his efforts, Ronnie got stepped on and turned into a smear. The rest of it came out and grinned at me, leered at me, pressed its face up against me as I cried, and curled into a ball in the corner. But the military was already on the way. A bunch of planes, tanks and soldiers started to show up. They just got destroyed. No weapon phased it. No armour could withstand it. The thing just piled their corpses up in front of me, and while it never spoke, it felt like a more or less told me to count them. It just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. More than I as a child who hadn't even attended school yet could count. And I kept feeling this existential terror, especially when I saw some of the tanks had a hammer and a sickle. I was young and didn't understand geopolitics, but I understood that meant Soviet. When I finally woke up, it was taller than any mountain, just of wrecked vehicles and dead bodies, like it had killed every soldier in the world and very politely kept them as intact as possible, just to flaunt them in front of me. It seemed especially fond of killing other dragons, especially more heroic ones. Like those were an affront to it. It killed Godzilla. It grew to the size and just started biting and scratching him. It took off one of his arms, then flew him into the air and dropped him. Godzilla breathed his thermonuclear death breath, but it just dodged the beam. Godzilla tried crawling off the water and I screamed for him not to. The dragon disappeared and reappeared in the water, dragged him in and started gouging out his eyes. I don't think it actually killed him. I think it just wanted to make the good dragon suffer. Superman, the Christopher Reeve Superman, yes, that Superman, punched it through a building and then kicked it into the clouds. I immediately started looking around for water it could jump out of, but instead it just dove back down like a falcon and rammed him into the ground, then picked him up and started slamming him into the ground over and over, sinking its claws in deeper and deeper. It let go to start smashing him with its tail into a deeper and deeper hole. He kept trying to get up, but every time he did, the tail would just come down again. It waited for him to try before it hit again. Then, when he stopped moving, sunk a claw into him, bit down on his head, and decapitated him. Opened its mouth to show me his head, stuck in its teeth. I could have sworn at one point there was a nuclear explosion. It just walked out of the mushroom cloud like nothing happened. I had never seen a single Nightmare on Elm Street before. Even as an adult, that carries hard disapproval from my grandparents. But all children in the 80s knew who Freddy Krueger was. He was kind of ever-present, referenced in children's cartoons. There were cardboard cutouts in rental stores. Apparently when I was 2, there was one cutout that scared me enough that I wouldn't even go to that side of the store. Freddy showed up and came after me. Then the dragon showed up, grabbed his legs with one talon, and started using him as a scratching post with the other. He was killing other monsters that were trying to get me, actively torturing me and hurting other nightmares for daring to think that they had the right to terrorize me. I was for it, and it alone to torment. Some of it was just senseless. Those were people that could fight back, but then you could get into eating Disney characters, Looney Tunes. It was devouring fucking Sesame Street characters and Mr. Rogers in front of me, just to horrify me. It tore up stuffed animals I had emotional attachments to, anything I loved in life or even had a passing fondness of. Of course, it still vastly preferred those closest to me. I don't know how many times or how many ways I saw it kill my mother. Jesus Christ, stepfather and stepsister were 3 things it never attacked, which I find very curious now in hindsight. But Jesus never showed up, let alone God. I think that might have been the hardest thing. I was very religious at the time. My family were. Whatever doubts my mother had been washed away by this whole experience. If hell is the absence of God, then these dreams were hell. It didn't matter where I slept. This thing would come almost nightly, and for the next few months of my life, made my nights a living hell. We tried to pray it away. We did it every night. Maybe it helped for a little while, but it would always come back. There wasn't a week that passed without a dragon dream for about a third of a year. Sometimes they would calm down and I would go a month without one. But from late age 4 to about 6, this thing terrorized me over a year. I would always be skittish around water as a result, even if I knew it never came outside of dreams. Well, it didn't now. It was very real when it first attacked me, and the story of me flying out of the bathtub screaming is corroborated by my mother saying it happened. That was no dream, even if it was just an apparition. I was wide awake the first time it attacked me. When I saw a person or character or animal it had eaten recently, I might just break down and sob on the spot. It was tearing me down even outside my dreams. It made sure I couldn't do anything without being reminded of it. Though that would come to an end. Not by growing out of it, no. By inundation, I started to grow more and more bold. It didn't like that. It didn't like it when I threw rocks at it, or when I stopped screaming in terror and started screaming in rage. So it stopped attacking my family and started attacking me. It felt so real, tearing my flesh with its teeth, skewering my abdomen with talons, breaking limbs with that tail. Constant agony. It hurt even after I woke up. My mother was a little less supportive here, suggesting it was just growing pains and bad dreams, but this wasn't any normal nightmare. Talking to her now, she admits to saying that mostly just to make me feel better. In truth, she thought I had suffered a sort of demonic possession. More praying, more chanting scripture. The pastor got involved. That was when he and his wife became a major target. I know at one point she took me to see a therapist, and this was probably around that time, but it wasn't especially helpful. Regardless, the dragon was sure to kill him too, just to remind me no one could help me. I suspect the therapist didn't believe we were actually living in a haunted house, let alone that this was my mother's second time. Not that I blame anyone for skepticism. If you haven't experienced such a thing for yourself, I can hardly get angry at you for seeing this as some trauma brought on by what that witch had done. Either way, she's responsible. But I assure you, this was all very real for me. I think the goal was to destroy my spirit, wear me down, to leave me as nihilistic of a husk of a person as it could as a young age. It wanted to crush my hope. She wanted to hurt my mother through me. But it wasn't through prayer or through psychology that I healed myself. I did that myself. It had gotten me scared to confront it again when I was the target. But that can only happen so many times before you start getting feisty again. Before you start fighting back. I was starting to do that again. It really didn't like that. Anytime I fought back too hard, I would wake up. A few times I felt like I was turning the tables on it. I recall specifically putting out its eye in one dream with a knife as it bit me. A frantic last-ditch spiteful attack, like a seal biting at a great white or Captain Ahab's last words, from the pit of hell I stab at thee. In every subsequent dream, it didn't have that eye. Now I was getting even more brazen. I was still scared of it, but when it showed up, well, funny thing, nihilism. Even if I didn't understand it as a concept at that age, I do now, and you just don't care. I would actually lunge at it and attack it whenever it would show itself. Sure, I would get pulverized for it, ripped to pieces. I wanted to fight it though. But then, something very different happened. It was just before starting school. I was reunited with Tigger in a dream. That happy, passive orange tabby in a nice open field. I pulled him into my lap and rubbed his belly as he purred for me as though to say he was okay and everything was alright now. It was the first dream I had with him since he died. Then the clouds came. With them, rain. I don't think I need to say where this is going, but it had never come out of the rain before. This was the first time. Like some phantom, it just materialized out of the pouring rain. I was up and running immediately. The ground was soaked by the sudden deluge, though. The mud sucked off my shoes, my socks. Even as I ran through the bog and sank to my knees, I knew that the demon dragon was actually after. I threw Tigger to give him as much of a head start as I could. He tried to run. That demon leaned over me and snatched him up in those jaws, flayed him open, and threw him in my face. I laid face down in the mud, covered in cat guts and blood. I turned to look up at it, and the bastard was smiling at me. A wide grin showing off all those dagger teeth in its distended maw. No real nostrils to speak of. Just a slight protrusion from the rest of its head. A stubby little snout full of knives and malevolence and sadistic glee. Before I could respond, I woke up. I just stared at the ceiling for a moment before I furrowed my brow and ground my teeth together. I wasn't sad. I wasn't scared. I was just angry. Maybe it was a silly thing to be a final straw. Wouldn't killing me or my family members be much worse? All that time it literally slew the armies of the world. But for me at the time, that was just it. Of all the shitty things this night terror had done to me, that was by far the shittiest in my mind at the time. Letting me reunite just to take that brief moment of happiness and closure away from me. I closed my eyes shut again. I relaxed, I calmed down. And I forced myself to go back to sleep. That, in of itself, is hard, especially when you just got so worked up. I don't know if I could do it now as an adult all that easily. To start back up again in the dream you were just having must be even harder. That's never happened to me before or after. This was the first, last, and only time. The dragon was walking away in the rain when I got up. It stopped and turned around dumbstruck. Then I started to run to it, slugging through the mud with purpose. That made it a little unnerved. I had seen it grimace or scowl in irritation before, but had never seen it even a little frightened. It was that I came back. It was that it had dismissed me from the realm of dreams and I came back. That intimidated it. I never talked to it before outside of screaming or making emphatic pleas for mercy, or yelling for it to leave me alone. Here, I spoke one sentence to it. How dare you? The sheer audacity that it would do that. Do that to him after what happened to him in real life. That I said actually startled it, scared it. It looked me over, noticing how the mud wasn't bogging me down anymore, how I was almost skimming across it as I broke into a run. It began to backpedal. Some massive dragon bigger than a Tyrannosaurus stepping back from an angry 6-year-old. It would be amusing if I wasn't so blindingly pissed. If now, some 30 years later, I wasn't still so blindingly pissed. It was too late to run. I vaulted myself at its face, clearing the 20 or so feet this beast had from the ground, and latched on, biting and scratching and tearing out gouts of its face. It threw me off and slashed at me with its claws. I didn't care. I didn't care how much the wound hurt or how deep it was, or if my guts were hanging out or anything else. I jumped back on it and started biting and scratching again, ripping out chunks of scaled flesh and leaving black blood to ooze out and foam. It threw me again and brought its tail down like a hammer. I grabbed it even as I was mashed into the ground and started biting and scratching it. It flung me from its tail. I landed on my feet and ran back at it, even as it started to turn to rout completely. There would be no escape. As this happened, the rain poured harder. The ground turned to quicksand. Hail fell from the sky, and bolts of lightning filled the air. It was using everything at its disposal to slow me down, to get me off, to beat me down, but I wouldn't quit. I wouldn't accept anything less than the beast's demise. I leapt back into its face and rammed an open palm into its one remaining good eye, made a fist and pulled it out. I was rewarded with a deafening scream, the most shrill roar you could imagine. Something that was once a bass, deep and guttural, was now a squealing soprano. I wasn't done, but even as I started biting and scratching again, it pulled me down into its jaws. Did it think I cared? Did it think I gave even the remotest of damns? Even as the wind and hail and rain and thunder beat at my body, even as it brought tornadoes down from the sky, I started biting and scratching its tongue, those disgusting protruding goblin shark gums, the inside of its mouth. It tried to spit me out. No, I refused. It tried to swallow. I found this acceptable. Its throat would pay the price as I lashed out with my fangs, slashed with clawed fingertips, biting and scratching, all the way down. I could hear its bellowing even over the relentless pounding of hailstones, even over the beating of its wings as it took flight, even over the sound of the whirlwinds it summoned to try to pull me off it, even over the sound of my own angry screaming, given to some feral rage. I did so much biting and scratching, I tore my way through its stomach and outside of it. Even as I tumbled to the ground, I landed on my feet and started chasing it again, just snarling and growling and carrying on. Through hail, through lightning striking me. Even when twisters whipped around me, I kept coming as it tried to fly away. I was gaining. It was going to die. I could still taste its blood and I wanted more. I could feel its impending doom, and so could it. That's when my mom woke me up. It was understandable once I realised the state I was in. I'd grabbed one of my stuffed animals, a large hippo bigger than I was, and I had, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Hippo. I didn't mean to bite your face off and rip your limbs from your body. I started crying. Mum pulled me out of bed and got all the cotton or whatever that poor hippo was stuffed with off me. All the little tatters of his grey skin. Made sure I hadn't swallowed too much of him. I blubbered out what had happened. She was happy? Maybe this will be the end of it. Of course, I wasn't happy. She could see that, especially given the cat. I think hearing about him made her tear up too. As any good mother should, she did her best to soothe and assuage my misery. But I was melancholy for the first and rest of the week. Just bitter. I wouldn't dream about the dragon again. That is actually the source of my bitterness. Maybe I am too vengeful, but writing this now, 30 years later, I'm still upset. I didn't intend for this part of the story to be so long. I actually had another story I wanted to tell in the same post, and now this one is so long it needs its own post. But it was like the floodgates opened. The more I remembered, the more I wrote. The more I wrote, the angrier I got. The angrier I got, the more I remembered. Everything about this early time of my life is hazy, but this is a laser focus. I feel emotionally drained. I wanted to tell more stories, but it's going to have to be these three. I've always been a jaded, pessimistic person to some degree, and I think it started here. I never realised the impact this had on me. I just wanted to tell a spooky true story that could also work as a creepypasta. And this just ate my entire night and came back for seconds. While writing this, I got so mad. Mad to the verge of tears. And not over my mom being pushed out of a hayloft by a malevolent spirit or some eclectic lunatic with delusions of grandeur murdering cats. I was wrong. I didn't heal myself. The scar is still there, and it's ugly and pulsating. I traded one kind of wound for another. I still can't get over that I didn't manage to kill it. That it had escaped, maybe to terrorize someone else. Maybe I did, but I didn't see a corpse. I had my victory taken from me. It isn't about competitiveness. It was about paying that bastard back for everything it did to me. It didn't suffer enough. I want to terrorize it like it did me. I wanted to see the fruits of its labour, to see how it helped me into the spiteful, angry person I am today. I want to see the look of horror on its face when it realises I'm even worse now than when I was 6. No blind rage. Take my time. Work him over slowly like it did in so many of my nightmares. I still can't deal with the fact that it got away.